Hello everyone, I'm James Milan and welcome. Tonight we are going to be having a moderated conversation as a 2019 town meeting special event. The moderated conversation will be about the zoning bylaw changes, proposed changes that are going to be before town meeting this year. And as undoubtedly you are aware, these changes have elicited both strong passions and a certain amount of confusion for Arlington residents. And our aim tonight in this conversation is to elucidate as best we can the various issues and make sure that we give a full airing to the multiple perspectives that are out there around these issues, and that we leave you much better informed by the end of this conversation. While this is a conversation and not a debate, there are a couple of aspects that we will carry over from debates, and the first of those is that our two guests will each have 3 minutes for opening statements, and at the end of the conversation they will also have 2 minutes for closing statements. Because I know that part of each of their opening statements is explaining why it is that they are here and representing the viewpoints that they are, I'm going to leave that to them to do so. But let me just introduce our guests, and on the left on your screen is Michael Ruderman, and nearer to me, to your right, is Andrew Bunnell. And having given you their names, I'm going to let them explain what it is and why it is that they are the appropriate people to be here talking to each other and to you tonight. So without further ado, Andrew, please proceed.
Thank you, James. Again, I'm Andrew Bunnell. I am the chair of the Arlington Redevelopment Board and have been for the last several years. I've served on the board since 2013. I'm a real estate lawyer, and I have a background in real estate and land use law, as well as economic development and reuse of certain kinds of blighted properties. Here tonight, we'll talk about the 2019 zoning bylaw amendments. And this has been a process the town has gone through over the last several years since the adoption of the master plan by town meeting a few years ago. We're responding to goals and recommendations from the master plan to focus on Arlington's healthy neighborhoods, strong local economy, enhanced civic amenities, and a better quality of life for current and future residents as well. And it's also important that we balance progress as we move through the master plan with preservation of the things that Arlington is really well known for. And I think that the way that we go about this is each town meeting cycle, we identify different areas of the zoning bylaw. We're working with a 40-year-old bylaw here that was revised last year in format, but not necessarily substantively. But we look at the zoning bylaw that need adjustment to fulfill master plan goals, to respond to the concerns and the needs of residents as we move into 2020 and beyond, correct different discrepancies in the bylaw, and improve clarity and consistency so that we can achieve all the goals of the master plan. As we plan for change and as we go through change, it will result in keeping these healthy neighborhoods in place, improving the local economy, and providing different amenities that people in town are really looking for. This year, we are focusing on housing. There's a housing crunch in the region, and as Arlington is not an island, we have to adapt and be able to answer the needs of an influx of people who want to live in Arlington and take advantage of the different amenities that we provide here. If we want to provide the types of housing that people are looking for in 2019 and in the future, we need to look at different types, mixed uses, different types of buildings that currently exist that the zoning bylaw doesn't necessarily allow for, and different kinds of dwelling units. We also have an aging population here in town, and it's important to be sure that they can stay, if not in their homes, in the town that they've come to know and love and be valued members of. Providing different kinds of housing options is of vital importance, and to make sure that they can remain in town and contribute to the society that we've all become part of here. With these zoning bylaws, we've identified commercial corridors in town as opportunities for growth by design, to keep the pressure away from less dense residential neighborhoods, which are known for, even though they have small lots, they're known for being green, having nice lawns, being well populated and friendly. Mass Ave has the capacity for growth. Broadway has the capacity for growth. These are the areas that these zoning bylaws, these amendments target. And one of the goals here is that any new development that comes into town as a result of these should be directed to locations near existing assets, transit, and other services, which is what brings us here this evening.
Thank you very much. And Michael Ruderman.
Thank you, James. Good evening. My name is Michael Ruderman. I'm a town meeting member from Precinct 9, and I've been working in the technical analysis of real estate for about the last 35 years. In fact, it was an interest in real estate that brought me first to town meeting and to run for election as a town meeting member 18 years ago. I was one of the first contributors and one of the final reviewers of last year's recodified zoning bylaw, the first top to bottom clean copy of all the bylaws and their accumulated amendments in over 40 years. Through that process, I met many more residents and other town meeting members who are particularly interested in zoning. Some of them have formed an organization this year called Arlington Residents for Responsible Redevelopment, and together we've been attending the hearings, reading the drafts, commenting on the proposed zoning changes. First, let me say how much I appreciate the undertaking that the Redevelopment Board has brought onto itself here. The ARB, town meeting members, we're all volunteers. We're all seeking the same things. Arlington's improvement, making it a more prosperous, accessible home, guarding our open space, preserving the housing stock we have, and fighting economic displacements. As Andrew cited, these are all goals that are found in the town's master plan, which town meeting approved in 2015. Zoning is the means and the practice that ties all these goals together, a process by which we formally decide what we will have in our town and where. The entire look and feel of a community is based on its zoning. And let me say one of the first cliches that I ever heard of in the real estate business, and that is zoning is destiny. Whatever you zone for, whatever you allow, will eventually happen. So to carry out the master plan, to fulfill those goals, to create the destiny that zoning predicts, I want to ask three questions throughout our consideration of the proposed zoning changes. First, does it promote the creation of more truly affordable housing and contribute to Arlington's economic diversity? Second, does it grow our commercial base? Does it encourage jobs in town? Does it provide some relief from the taxpayers, the residential taxpayers, who currently now carry 96% of the town's budget? Third, what does it do to help fill the vacancies in the existing commercial base and keep those neighborhoods vital? Again, thank you again to James, to Andrew. Looking forward to a real back and forth exchange of ideas tonight.
Great. One of the things that we have heard in public conversation over these last weeks and months is different ideas about how the process has unfolded and how much public input there has been, et cetera. So I'd like to introduce, and I plan to do this with a number of topic areas that you guys can then engage with each other directly around, and then when that reaches its fruition, then we will move on to the next topic. So I'd like to focus first on the process, and just throw that out to you both as knowledgeable, as people on the front line of that, and talk about how that has been for yourselves and for the community. Would you like to start, Andrew?
I'd be happy to. And it's difficult to discuss any process without getting a little bit of a history lesson as to how we got to where we are today. And each year, the Arlington Redevelopment Board sits down and sets goals based on the master plan and the housing production plan. This has been the case since I arrived on the board in 2013. Beginning with the master plan is really the most important thing to understand, and that this is an ongoing process over a number of years. I said I started on the board in 2013. The master plan process was already underway at that point and had been for at least a year, with a number of public meetings, all advertised and open, public conversations, all well-attended conversations about what the town wanted as a whole and how those needs and goals could be achieved as the master plan was undertaken. And so what we have now is a document approved by the ARB and adopted by town meeting, where we really have a clear vision and guideline for how we want, and when I say we, I mean Arlington as a whole, how Arlington wants to proceed into the future. Now, there are a number of different goals in there. This year we're talking about housing production. There are also discussions about environmental discussion, land use, which ties somewhat into housing production, and commercial use. All of these things are being considered as we move forward here. We're also challenged with a region-wide housing crisis. Housing prices have far outpaced income in every neighboring community here, and it's an important thing for the ARB to consider as we look at different zoning considerations and different amendments here, which really drives many of the items that we're going on here. One of the major tasks required or recommended by the master plan was that we recodify the zoning bylaw, which again, as Michael pointed out, is a 40-year-old document that had been patchworked over time. And much of it was outdated, didn't work, it was difficult to use. We went through an exhaustive process through that last year, and Michael was a voice assisting us through that process and making sure that the bylaw actually worked, ultimately passed town meeting overwhelmingly last winter. Since then, we've undertaken this next step to promote substantive, realistic changes that will allow Arlington to address the challenges of the regional housing crisis specific to its situation as a town neighboring a major metropolis, impacted by a major metropolis. It's no longer the sleepy bedroom community that I think people imagine it once was, but it's a vibrant, thriving town as it is. Our goal is to try to capture the things that make it vibrant and thriving and push those forward to make it better for everybody that lives here now and everyone that will want to move here in the future.
Okay, before I ask for your response, Michael, I just want to say that what I heard you saying then is that the master plan is the guiding document for you guys to then put into place kind of a step-by-step process over a period of years, and that you are asserting that there has been ample public input or points for public input throughout that process.
So each step of the process involves not just board and staff input, but a diverse cross-section of the community to meet and discuss these items. These meetings are public meetings. They're conducted in the open. Town and staff, town officials and board members, members of other subcommittees, members of groups like the ones Michael is part of, have all been involved in the various zoning bylaw amendments that have been put forth, not only this year, but in years past. And there's always a robust discussion in these meetings. ACMi doesn't record all of them, but notes are kept to get to some sort of consensus that then comes up to the ARB, where additional discussion is had. And we allow for vibrant and thorough public comment. We take that public comment very seriously and try to respond as appropriately as possible.
Sure.
It's true, the master plan is our overall guiding text here for what the ARB's proposed zoning changes seek to accomplish. The master plan is also an aspirational document. It incorporates in its various chapters quite a number of goals that through 2012, 13, 14, 15, people were judging and considering and adding their input into the process. Implementing the master plan to me is a balancing act. We look at the chapter that talks about open space and how important open space is in Arlington's neighborhoods, not just Morningside, not just Kelwyn Manor, but along Massachusetts Avenue too. We talk about preserving the traditional housing stock that we have in town, not just in the center, not just in East Arlington, but along Broadway and Summer Street. The master plan talks about housing production. Of course, it's cognizant of what comes about when we produce more housing. We produce more residents. We're going to need to provide services for these residents. How much can we grow and still maintain the level of services that right now our town leaders are trying to figure out how to mount a campaign for overriding the tax rate for the next several years. That's going to come in June. How do we balance the many goals that are in the master plan and keeping Arlington the town that we love and we recognize? It's true, there is a region-wide housing crunch. How much can Arlington do for that? How much should Arlington be doing for the residents who live here now and who are already facing the pressure of rising rents or buildings being taken out of the rental market, torn down or rehabilitated and turned into condominium, single unit housing? The master plan is both a set of goals and a set of challenges. And I'm trying to remain mindful of all of the yes and or yes but also's that the master plan implies. The public process for considering this year's zoning changes, yes, it has been robust. Yes, it has been full of comment. It's also been on a lot of weeknights. And I keep on thinking of the quip that's attributed to Oscar Wilde that democracy belongs to the people who have the most Monday nights. It's really hard to get a truly diverse cross-section of everyone in Arlington if all of the meetings conflict with bedtime and bath time. Now, you've been very receptive of the comments that you've heard. I hope that they are reflective of the whole community. I've been hearing a lot of questions and anxieties and disturbance. And of course, we can say that we've had all these meetings, we've advertised them, we've published things on the website, we've put up copious amounts of documentation. Yes, that's true. But until everyone feels comfortable with the concepts, we still have to work to acquaint people with what it is we're doing and why and what it's going to mean where they live and how it's going to turn out for them in the end. So we have to continue the process of making our case. And if we can't make the case to the last people who get on board, then maybe we should look back at what we're trying to convince them of and see what we can change there.
Would you like to respond, or shall we move on?
I think we can move on.
Okay. Most of the changes that we are talking about that seem to have really riled people up or gotten much public comment are the density provisions. And Michael, you already mentioned in your opening statement that one of the questions that you have are what are the implications for raising revenue, say from businesses or from expanding our commercial tax base, perhaps. So I'd like to talk about that, both how you see what you see are the ramifications of these zoning bylaw changes, if assuming that they go through, how you think that will impact that situation.
I think we're looking at, if you can imagine, a real estate market that's even hotter than it is today. Just turning up the velocity of the residential real estate market even more. There are a number of proposed changes which would redefine the uses of lots of land where 1- and 2-family houses sit today. Yes, they're in the corridors that have been designated for more dense development, but saying that we can put more people on Mass Ave and Broadway is simply saying, maybe a nickel's worth 10 cents. It is if we say so. Whatever the rules are, if we write them that way, then yes, it can happen. Should it, though? Even the people that live in these 1- and 2-family houses along Mass Ave and Broadway, they're dealing with the impacts of extra traffic, extra noise, the commutes that go by their doorsteps all day long. To grow the residential housing block style buildings that are along these corridors will also mean interposing within neighborhoods. And yes, there are residential neighborhoods along Mass Ave and Broadway. Interposing into these neighborhoods large looming structures which will certainly change the look and feel of those stretches, certainly create shadows upon neighboring properties that aren't there today, as well as increasing the typical concomitants of extra development, noise, traffic, things like that. But mostly what I'm concerned about is the impact on the folks next door. When you decide that you can take a 5 or an 8 or a 10,000 square foot lot and redevelop it into a 4 or a 5 unit building of housing, and that goes up next to the folks who've lived in the 1 or the 2 family house for so many years, what does that do to their aspect of where they live?
Should it is an interesting question you posed just now. These zoning changes aren't created in a vacuum, and they're intended to work hand in hand with the existing review process that the ARB and the ZBA in other districts is required by law to utilize in its analysis of a project. Environmental design review doesn't just mean environmental considerations as far as one would think, but how a building interacts with the environment surrounding it. So we look at things like height, and the board has a wide discretion to ask for things like shadow studies, traffic studies, parking studies. We are allowed to go below certain requirements if a builder asks and provides certain trade-offs in those, in connection with those requests. One of the items that the board struggled with is the discussion of heights, building heights as they abut residential neighborhoods, and chose to back off from what was initially proposed and keep things as they are, and require that any builder provide a finding if they're seeking to build a building that is higher, to show with no uncertain terms that there will be no negligible effect or impact on any abutters. And this is all considered not only by the board itself, but presented in public and allowing for any abutters who are all notified of any project as a matter of law to come and speak and give their piece. There have been projects in the past where we have had builders pull back, builders change the size and outlay of their proposal. So what is ultimately built becomes much less than what they've actually proposed. Many of the more controversial articles that were proposed, the board heard a lot of comment on in the last few weeks. And as I said, took that seriously. Not only did we receive those comments in person via public meetings, but with close to 100 emails from a wide cross-section of town, both supporting and not of these articles. And so what has ultimately resulted is a pullback on many of the more difficult questions, where we've kept the residents of town in mind as we're moving forward with this, but also keeping in mind the need for these commercial corridors to be able to evolve. I think James made a mention of commercial use. And 2 years ago, town meeting adopted the mixed use bylaw, which allows for commercial or retail use on a first floor and residential use on second, third, and above there as allowed. One of the studies that's been done as this bylaw has come into place is that the existing zoning bylaw makes it difficult for these kinds of buildings to be built because of setbacks, of open space requirements, of height requirements, et cetera. And allowing many of the outdated commercial spaces to be redeveloped to a use where they're really at their maximum use is important and is a goal of town. And I think that many of these changes will get to that and allow us to expand the commercial base in town. And I agree with you, it's very difficult to keep a town running when 96% of the financial burden is based on homeowners. And one of my goals as chair and one of the board's goals is to find ways to expand the commercial and industrial base in town with a very limited map, as you know.
It brings up the question of, what can we do through our own town's legislative process to encourage the investment and the development of commercial structures that will serve next year and next decade and the next generation's business needs. I know that's a really tough question to pose, but let me give you a suggestion. If we could have this process, say last summer, when I believe the first rollout of this or that type meetings began, I would have suggested this. I would have suggested, look, for the buildings that simply cannot accommodate any more parking to grow, do we give that requirement away, as I think there are certain portions of the proposed changes which do, or do we put a price on substituting parking? Do we tell commercial property owners, yes, you can build taller, higher, denser, steeper. You don't have to provide as much parking, but the town is going to exert a fee. And with that fee, we're going to come up with an equivalency of some sort for what a parking space costs. We're going to take that money, we're going to invest it in something that fosters customers getting to your building. Perhaps it could be something as inexpensive as some cognate of what in Lexington is the Lex Express, a shuttle devoted to the town. If it truly proved to be very successful, we could look at that as an income stream into the future and build more parking. We go around and around talking about, well, we need more parking, we wish we had more parking. The solution is to build more parking. Where would the money come from? The money could come from linkage fees for projects which are allowed to exchange a style and a size of development and not include the parking, and allow the town to take the money and provide parking somewhere else. It comes from a rather personal example that I remember. One of my neighbors in the center of Arlington used to be a very well-respected and regarded engineering firm, Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager. They had been in Arlington Center for a couple of decades. They're famous for structural analysis, especially failure analysis. They were never busier than after September 11th, when they were called in to examine what had actually happened at the World Trade Towers. But of all the services they perform, their headquarters was right here in Arlington. They were expanding. They were happy with the location. All of their employees were rather considered themselves quite lucky to be able to to be able to work in the midst of a community where all the other amenities were provided for. Places to eat, places to bank, places to get their laundry cleaned, a post office, all those things that you don't have out on office park land on Route 128. But that's where they went, because they finally outgrew the parking lot that they had. And it would have been too expensive for them to build on that site. There was no option for them to substitute a payment for parking somewhere else in town. They had to decamp. So what I'm trying to think of is, what are the businesses that we want to attract in 10 or 15 years? What are the commercial products or services that Arlington can become as famous for? And what can we build today that'll suit that? I wish I could say that there was a roadmap to that in these zoning changes, which don't have to be perfect. They have to accomplish something good, but I would raise the level of good just a little bit higher to provide a more directed, lucrative future for commercial properties.
I don't know if you have a response to that, or otherwise we will move on as well.
No, you said a lot. And you said a lot that is somewhat under the control of the ARB and somewhat under the control of the select board, and somewhat under the control of every resident in town. It's an interesting proposition. It's far off of, I think, what we're here to discuss tonight, which is zoning specifically. But I do know that as the town's economic development department continues to look at different opportunities and attract different businesses that might be interested in coming here, these are discussions that will happen, should happen, and absolutely need to happen. I think parking town-wide is a discussion that needs to be revisited from the ground up.
Literally.
Whether it's a situation of on-street parking or adding decks to the lot in the center to accommodate additional parking. These are all ideas that should be discussed, and I'm happy to continue on with that discussion when we move forward there.
The interjection that makes it germane is that when you began to have the hearings back last summer on what you were thinking about proposing in town meeting 8 months hence, it was all focused on residential amendments. If there had been public input at that point in time, it wouldn't be so out of scope today to be talking about targeted measures to increase the value of commercial blocks along the side of Mass Ave that could grow to 4 or 5 stories without shading other neighbors, because their shade would be cast across the street. You know, a more targeted approach to how we wish to grow commercial real estate and make blocks more valuable. I think a number of our commercial blocks, especially in the center, have not been kept up with in terms of capital investment, because you know the invisible hand of the market is making them lucrative enough for their owners today. Could they be developed into higher and better purposes? I'm certain of it, but there just isn't the incentive to do that, and there are the impediments. Chief impediment is parking. So let's hope that we can come back to this question in another session of back and forth long-range planning before we get to the stage of here's picture A, here's picture B. Put the sticker on the picture that you like.
Okay, so we'll table parking for now for further consideration. And I'd like to pause in the introduction of topics by ACMi and invite the two of you, as we are about at the halfway point in this conversation, you are each now invited to pose a question to the other and go ahead and talk that through. And why don't we start with you, Michael Ruderman?
Sure. Andrew, anyone who has any sense of Arlington's history knows that the way people make a living in town today is different from how it was 20 years ago or 100 years ago or even more. And I was wondering what occupations or land uses do you see that are particularly endangered in Arlington today and likely to either come under increasing pressure for their land being more valuable for something else, or perhaps disappearing, and that there just won't be the common job category of X in Arlington if we were to come back to this table in 20 years' time?
I think we're pretty fortunate as a town of a variety of incomes, a variety of needs, and a variety of desires, where we are not particularly at risk of losing any of the vital businesses that exist in town right now. I think you see a number of small businesses, small independent businesses thriving throughout town, where people can both live and work in Arlington, which is a wonderful amenity for people to have if they can take advantage of it. I think based on the building stock, many of those could be encouraged. I think you could have a very good mix throughout town of small independent businesses in buildings that might just need a facade renovation, and larger restaurants, for example, or co-working spaces, which there is a major need for as we move forward, thinking a little bit outside of what's traditionally considered for employment. Most people, well, I shouldn't say most people, many people have transitioned from a commute to an office environment downtown to a work from home model or a remote work model. I know Work Bar that's in town right now is bursting at the seams and can't handle the capacity that it currently has, and is looking for more space, hopefully here in Arlington, to be able to utilize some of this. space that I hope is built in the near future.
Nothing like a 19th century mill building to keep on proving its value over time.
Exactly.
I'd be most afraid of losing my place in town if my business depended on a place to park a lot of trucks and landscaping materials. And I think that if we continue to push the limits of where we can build residential property and how much of it, I think a number of the longtime landscaping businesses in this town are simply going to look at what the latest offer that came in the mail today was for their plot of land and say, you know what, we're never going to make as much money. We'll have to sell. That's who I would be fearful for.
So, excuse me, Michael, but I just want to clarify. You're saying basically that that what you see as an inexorable expansion of areas in which residential properties can be built are going to be, you fear, squeezing?
What we're doing is we're taking parcels of property and proposing to increase the amount of residence that can be built on them. I think is it in R4 where we're talking about taking the measurement of how much floor space to lot space, the floor area ratio, and changing that from 1.2 times the lot size to 1.8. It's a 50% increase in floor area ratio. That piece of land is going to become much more valuable if instead of building 2 units, you can build 3. If instead of building 4 units, you can build 6. What I'm afraid of is this process pushing out to areas where we're not putting buildings, we're running businesses that depend upon open space. Mm-hmm. And anyway, that's
But you're not saying that that's part of the current zoning change proposals?
I don't think any of those businesses are headquartered today on these parcels, but I can see the expansion of what we consider to be the housing footprint going deeper and deeper into areas that it hasn't been before.
And many of those businesses are zoned in industrial zones where residential development is not presently allowed, and there's certainly no intention to change that moving forward. We think it is valuable to keep those businesses in Arlington, to keep the jobs local, mm-hmm. and to allow them to stay and to thrive in place.
Okay, Andrew, your turn to ask a question.
Sure. So, parking aside, what do you see as Arlington's 3 biggest challenges, and how do you hope those are addressed in the next 20 years?
The one that's greater than everything else is the affordability of a place to live. I was looking at the figures from the latest report from the Bureau of the Census. I think it's 2017 numbers. There are a lot of people who are in really tough shape right now, and even before we talk about, which we must, how do we keep Arlington the place where we truly honor and accept diversity of income? There are a lot of people in Arlington right now who are renters who are, by all accepted measures, are strapped from meeting the rent today. I think it's about 38% of all renters across town are spending about 30% or more of their household budget just on the rent. For our senior citizens, that number grows to 50% are rent challenged. These are huge numbers which could topple over into a situation where there just isn't room for them anymore, and Arlington becomes a town of people who are passing through. And no one wants to have that. We want to have the longevity and the comfort and the willingness to get to know your neighbors, because your neighbors stay around for more than just 7 or 9 or 10 years while the kids are in the school system. We build a whole structure of volunteer organizations, people who participate in town government on the fact that people stay here for a while. But if 50% of our seniors and 38% of all of our renters overall are close to being maxed out on what it costs to rent a place in Arlington, I think that's the number one problem, the number one challenge. 2 and 3 are a ways after that. Number 2 is going to be transportation. Can we remain a livable town if it's so busy that nobody goes here anymore?
It'd be nice to have a red line stop in the center, wouldn't it?
You know, if we had a crystal ball, we could have looked forward from 1972 and said, you know, someday people are going to spend $900,000 for a single family house to live here, and they're going to expect transit. You know, if you could take that argument back 45 years ago and convince people of it, that would truly be magic. But we don't have that. We need, you know, transit times from one end of town to the other will remain the challenge second to the cost of rental housing. You know, we do have the Green Line expansion coming to within as they say in the transportation business, you know, the magic interval, 1 bus ride away. If you can get onto rapid transit with 1 bus and not 2 or 3, you can begin to get people to give up their single occupancy automobiles, because people will figure, you know, okay, bus might be late, but it's only 1 bus. I'm not going to get caught in between. So our ability to do that in Arlington is increasing through the Green Line GLX, Green Line expansion. But transit's going to be the second challenge to rental cost.
All right, we'll spare you having to identify the third for now, because that was plenty. Did you want to respond?
Sure. No, I think there are steps that have been taken to improve transit, particularly along Mass Ave with the addition of the bus lane. If only we could get the MBTA to cooperate a little bit more. But it's a good program.
It's an encouraging concept.
Working. And certainly I agree that transit is important, encouraging people to live near transit and not necessarily give up cars, but use cars less often, as we all would love to, would be a positive move.
Well, in answering your question, Michael identified without any ambiguity whatsoever that affordable housing, or the affordability of housing in town, is a major concern, and we've heard that voiced from public comment as well. So I know that there were changes right up until we are filming this on the 28th of March, and just last night some further changes were made to the amendments, or the articles, excuse me. And so Article 16 before town meeting this year has to do with affordable housing. Let's talk about that.
So Article 16 was initially submitted to increase affordable requirements for developments in town with 20 or more units. There isn't a whole lot of land in Arlington to build a development with 20 or more units. So we created a tiered requirement for affordability where 6 to 19 units would be increased to 15% of units as opposed to the current model, and 20 or more units would be up to 20% of units.
So let's just clarify what that means.
Sure.
You're saying that if somebody's going to build a building which is going to have 6 to 19 units, then 15% of those units have to be designated,
affordable housing. Affordable housing is calculated on a state metric of median area income that's allowed.
And that goes up to 20%, you said, if
it's go up to 20%. And what we've done here to encourage more, what we've seen in the past and what we've seen in other communities is builders will come in and they'll build up to the lot lines, they'll build as much as they can, but they'll build a 4 or 5 unit building. And what Article 16 does to answer many of the affordability questions that came up throughout our public comment period is it allows for certain bonuses to have a developer build a larger project by giving the town more affordable housing, by building more affordable units in those buildings. Because of that, it also necessarily encourages a diversity of units within the building. Whereas currently you see a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom units being built, the idea is that this is going to encourage more efficiencies on one end and more 3 bedrooms on the other end. That can house seniors who wish to stay in town, that can house families that need a little bit more space than a 2 bedroom unit would allow for, a mix of rental and ownership opportunities. What they would then be allowed to do by special permit, so with approval of the ARB, is to increase the footprint of the building, to reduce the landscaped and usable open space, still providing plenty to address the rhythm of the street, the flow of the street, and the feel of the street that exists as it is. Potentially, and only in cases where it's appropriate, increase height and continue to add to the housing stock in town at a wide variety of levels, not just creating a situation where you have high-end housing at one end of the road and affordable housing only. The idea is to create a number of workforce level units and mid-market units as well.
It sounds like a great plan. Let me make sure I understand. We're going to give 4 and 5 unit developments a bonus to allow them to build more densely, and that's in the hope that they will incorporate within those 4 or 5 units units of more varied size and cost and affordability. Do I understand that right?
Bear with me for a second. That's not entirely correct. They're allowed the density bonus by right, but they do have to comply with special permit regulations, with existing setbacks that are currently in place, with environmental design review. It's not just go in and put a 5-story building on the lot here. No. It has to suit the environment appropriately. There aren't too many lots in town that would provide for that. I don't think you'll see too much
Sorry,
change.
let me just interject. I want to make sure what you're addressing, Michael, is the fact that the situations that Andrew was just describing begin at 6 units and up, and you're talking about for developments that are smaller than that.
Right. We're basing the premise for a number of changes to allow larger, steeper, tighter construction of 4 and 5 unit buildings on the premise that this will allow the builder more flexibility in the way the units themselves are built, and that should result in more flexibility in prices.
That's correct. Yep.
I don't think it works. I don't think it works like that. What we've seen in Arlington, even in the larger buildings such as at 887 Mass Ave, which was built under the most recent changes in our zoning bylaws.
It was approved under the prior zoning bylaw.
That's right, it was approved under prior. It has the bare minimum required by its size of an affordable unit. Is that correct?
It has it has an affordable unit in there as was required under the zoning change, under the zoning bylaw at the time. It was permitted.
Right, but the other units that are in that building, they don't exhibit much variety of price or cost or affordability. I don't see the economic logic of counting on builders to build some units less expensively, or some units that are destined to sell or rent for a lower number just because we would like it to turn out that way. My premise is this: affordable housing, truly affordable housing, housing that can be met by folks who families with 80% of the average median income in town who can pay about at that rate it's about $1,700 or $1,800 a month. Private builders aren't building those units. They're just not. There's nothing in town that's being built today, or there are two apartments available in town at that rate this morning when I did some online searching. And giving builders the opportunity to put more units into a structure and hoping that will turn out to create a mix of sizes and costs and affordabilities. The hope doesn't bear out. I think economic sense is telling these folks, invest the capital, make it as lucrative as possible. It's just logic. And if the town wants to increase its stock of affordable housing, this is going to have to be a town obligation. 62% of all of the affordable units in town are owned by Arlington. The next 21% were built by nonprofits, such as the Housing Corporation of Arlington. The 17% or so that are left over are either a scattering of units built under the inclusionary bylaw, where 6 required 1, or units that were built through financing that was predicated on the builder designating certain units as affordable. And these numbers go back, over 35, 36 years. No one builds really affordable in housing in Arlington who doesn't have to. I would love it if simply by saying, you can put 8 units here. Please make a couple of them smaller than the others so we can get some people in here who can't afford to live in Arlington yet. I don't think wishing for it happens.
Well, as I said, and I'll answer your question in a few parts, every project that would be built still has to come before the board for special permit approval. And there are negotiations that can take place there where they can ask for certain parking reductions, for example, or open space reallocation or reductions in exchange for certain things. And one of those things that we would look for would be affordable units. You also mentioned that many of these buildings have been built over the last 34, 35, 36 years. There aren't that many buildings in Arlington that have been built in the last 36 years. And inclusionary zoning didn't exist until about 12 or 15 years ago. So much of what's built and populates the main commercial and residential corridors in town right now that could support those scale of buildings was built before anybody even thought about affordable housing or asked for builders to build affordable housing or required builders to build affordable housing. And
except if you were getting federal funds that were predicated on providing a certain number of units that were affordable to people with rental vouchers.
And unfortunately, those funds have dried up. Yes. So it's up to the town to ask builders to do their part, to come in and add to the value of these buildings, not necessarily a monetary fashion, but in a community fashion. And so by requiring some affordable housing, we're certainly doing more than we were 15 years ago. And it's a difficult problem to figure out where you do create an economic inequality in town. But given the fact that in my tenure on the board, we've seen 6 units built, not permitted, but built, that's shameful. And encouraging any addition of affordable housing here, which is what these proposals would do, I think is remarkable and needs to be strongly considered and move forward.
We're hoping for it. If these amendments pass, we're hoping that the environmental design review process, which gives extra credit or extra points towards builders and buildings that promote some extramural goals of the town. I really hope it works if we vote these through. I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical because we're trusting folks to do the right thing with encouragement where I would rather rely upon a regulation.
Well, I don't think we're trusting folks to do the right thing. We're saying do the right thing and. It's the yes and that you mentioned earlier. It's you can do what you've always done under the existing bylaw and nothing really changes. Or you can do X, Y, and Z. You give back, which gives you more, but you give back more to the community. And you work with the department, you work with the board, and you get to a point where we start to achieve the affordable housing goals.
I hope it's worth it because the buildings that your amendments imagine coming in the future are going to be tall. They're going to be steep. They're going to be set back at what, the 4th story instead of the 3rd story in certain areas?
They're allowed to, they're set back at 30 feet or the beginning of the 4th story, not the top of the 4th story.
Some friends of mine, I'm very grateful for them having contributed to my notes tonight, some shadow studies of what some of these buildings would look like in the neighborhood. Here's a representation of a building at the corner of Broadway and Warren, I believe. The shadows are hypothecated on sometime in the winter when the impact is the greatest to show what it would look like. I'll scroll down here. This is This is the build out and the shadow analysis of the building that's currently occupied by Fresh Pond Seafood. This is where the shadows will fall noontime and in the afternoon in the winter, sweeping across the neighborhood to the north and northeast.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed another one of the bylaw proposed changes would redefine the shadow setback, the area that you look at for the impact of the shadows on the dark side, the northeast side, significantly from 200 feet to, is it 50 feet?
It's 200 feet.
200
We decided not to make a change.
That's commendable.
And we decided, so there are a few things here. Many of these buildings,
Last one is a building on in the Russell Historic District if it were maxed out to height where the shadows would go.
so these consider height, max height, and height buffer zone. We're doing away with the height buffer zone. We're keeping it as is. If there's a conflict between two buffer zones, then the builder can ask for relief and come to us by requesting that they get the lower buffer, so it should allow them to build higher. But they'll have to show that there is no demonstrable negative impact on any neighbors. And that's a situation where we would, as we always do and get, the neighbors, we take the neighbors pretty seriously when these things come into place, because we're certainly not in the business of devaluing anybody's home.
Can I ask a question, Andrew? Because this is the second, at least the second, maybe the third time that you've mentioned that builders bear a certain burden of proof.
Yes.
In certain situations.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that actually play out? Do they just basically need to come in and convince the board that that is the case?
So I'll give you the answer that everyone loves. It depends. And one of the things that we're burdened with here in Arlington is that no two lots are exactly alike. And so no two projects are exactly alike, which is one of the reasons that we have environmental design review, and one of the reasons why, for the most part, I think environmental design review really does work when it comes to the impact on a neighborhood. If you're looking at this, actually, could you go back to the fish market example? I do want to talk about that. This particular building goes to the height buffer zone.
75 Summer Street.
75 Summer Street. Where's the parking?
Parking is presently in front of the building.
Okay. So there would have to be enough
in front
parking.
as you drive past it, below the existing structure as you look at it from on top.
All right. So, and I'm looking at this. This does cast quite a shadow. And as the original bylaw was proposed, there was a reduction to 50-foot buffer between the building and any R1, R2, and R0 districts. We have pulled back on that. The entire board thought it was wise to keep the height buffer as it exists. And if a builder wants to ask us for relief as part of their special permit application, they're certainly welcome to do so, but they have to provide a finding that their property will not cast a detrimental shadow on any of the neighboring properties within the existing height buffer or the proposed reduction. We would request shadow studies at different times of year, traffic studies, et cetera, all things that we currently request in a typical EDR review, but I think there's a heightened duty with what we're allowing. We certainly want to be sensitive to the neighbors that are already there.
Right.
And don't want to take away their sunshine.
I know you're waiting to respond, Michael, but I just need to, again, throw a point of clarification in here. And that is, when you talk about height buffers, and you're saying that instead of moving to 50, you decided to keep it at 200.
We decided to keep it at 200. Yeah.
Does that mean the the minimum amount of space between the building being built, the new height building, and residences? What is a height buffer?
So it's essentially the distance between the highest point of the building and the nearest residential unit.
Okay.
Yep. And so we looked at a number of analyses and how buildings could build up in this process. And we're shown through the review process a handful of different examples of what could and could not be built in town under this, the existing height. And what we ended up with was, bear with me for a minute. Something that looked like that. We don't want that. Well, now, and that's just a massing analysis, but it's to show where the height buffer is calculated by.
It's a massing analysis without any neighbors.
Right. There are neighbors. This is a parcel in East Arlington that was analyzed. And as the board looked through it,
the present Walgreens lot?
it is. And as we looked through it, as we considered it, realized that there are a number of spots in both East Arlington and Arlington Heights that could potentially be impacted. There aren't a lot of lots of that size and buildable lots of that size.
Sure.
But it's certainly not an impact that we wanted to pass on to neighbors. And so decided to keep things as they are and then layer on that additional requirement where, as a matter of course, a shadow study and a neighborhood impact study will be required with any application.
Well, that's good to hear, and I understand that these are evolving proposals even as we speak, from the night before last to last night.
Well, we voted last night as they are, and those will be what's put to town meeting, and those will be made public shortly. There's one other item that's left to be discussed, but not part of the density articles.
Okay.
All right. Well, amazingly enough, I don't know how it has felt for you, but an hour has zoomed by already. So we are going to move into the final phase of our conversation tonight. And for that, I would like to address just a couple of things, perhaps in combination or separating them. It's up to you guys. One of them is the idea of unintended consequences, which I know is, on the one hand, very difficult to identify what are, by definition, unintended consequences in a lot of ways. But I know that that is also an issue for some of the folks who are challenging these proposals, and I want to make sure that we address that issue. And then either in conjunction with, as I said, or separate from, I would like to know, and this might be more directed to you, Andrew, but by all means, Michael, if you have opinions about it, how are we going to know if this is working? What are the ways that we're going to evaluate or monitor these changes, assuming they go forward, and over what time period would we be looking at particular, I don't know, number of affordable unit increases, or whatever measure you want to make? What are those that you've identified, over what time period, and what can we do if it feels like it's not working at that point? So I know those may be two separate issues. I welcome either of you to jump into either one of those or a combination of the two.
Mm-hmm. We're always careful to look at the idea of unintended consequences. And there's always a careful analysis of what currently exists, what could exist in a worst or best case scenario on both sides, and what is likely to exist, and then craft bylaw amendments from that point. One of the things that I think is valuable is there are a lot of voices that are involved at every step of a project and as part of the public process begins. It begins with a handful of people in a committee. Then it comes to the ARB, and the ARB discusses things. Members of the public opine at meetings, at regular ARB meetings, and then as bylaw amendments are crafted and put into place, we encourage and welcome an open and honest public comment period, where we try to be as neutral as possible as we move through the comments to hear what people have to say. And I don't know if people have noticed, but we have a pretty educated, informed population here in Arlington, and a wide berth of expertise that has shown up and opined as we've moved through this process and given us some pretty valuable input that we've taken into consideration to be sure that any impact on the neighborhoods, while it may be different, is not negligible. And that's something that's careful.
I agree. It's one of the pleasures of serving in town meeting that you get to add your voice and what you feel familiar with and your own expertise to that of people who really are committed and really know what they're talking about and are volunteering this expertise to the benefit of all of us. I think one way that we can address the question of unintended consequences is to look at some of the objections that have been raised in your Article 15, which deals with permitting accessory dwelling units, ADUs, in the jargon of the business. And I think you heard from a citizens group called the Residential Study Group.
The Residential Study Group is not a citizens group. It's a part, it was put together out of town meeting in 2015. It is staffed by volunteer citizens, but it's under the purview of the Master Plan Implementation Committee and the ARB.
Okay.
With a wide diversity of voices there.
And I know they voted against allowing or voted to recommend no action on your Article 15, which would allow for accessory dwelling units. And they were following comments that they had received from a variety of sources, one from the head of our own town's inspectional services department, who was there at the meeting and saying, whatever regulations you put on them can't be enforced and won't be enforced because there's no way that the town has the capacity to be so intrusive as to go inside of these buildings and inspect them for compliance. I believe they also had comments from our fire chief saying that there was no way that he was feeling comfortable with allowing accessory dwelling units in town. And
Can you just clarify what accessory?
an accessory dwelling unit is a separate residence within a building that's already a residence.
Okay.
Typically, it's smaller. It is self-contained. It provides everything that
What we might think of as a mother-in-law's apartment or something like that,
Sure,
basically?
sure. But if the distinction is, though, it provides all of the bits and pieces that the state sanitary code requires you to have for a dwelling unit. Sink, toilet, bathroom, stove. These are the elements that you tick off to say, yes, this is a dwelling unit. It's separate from whatever else is in there. And
Thanks for that clarification.
it has come before town meeting before. It's come before town meeting twice in the last 8 years. Voted down each of those 2 times, both on enforceability, on reliability, that they would be safely constructed, and could be properly inspected, and on the concern that once we go to allowing separate dwelling units within existing one-family structures, we've kind of knocked the logic out of our zoning that says that some parts of town are R1, residential one residence per lot. If we allow them to be transformed into 2, well then the whole premise that R1 zoning is based on has been undermined. And these are the reasons the town meeting has looked at these requests for accessory dwelling units in the past and voted them down each time, and the Residential Study Group gave its opinion also on that they don't want this.
But is this, are you referencing this in terms of your argument about unintended consequences? Is there something related to?
I am, because the objections that were raised and heard and considered in the discussions of the Residential Study Group were along the lines of exactly that, unintended consequences. Units which could not be properly inspected, units which would increase the housing load in areas that are currently devoted to 1 house per lot.
So, did you want to say?
So I'll address Article 15, and the board did move to have town meeting answer the question on accessory dwelling units with conditions that didn't exist at the time the Residential Study Group had its opportunity to opine.
That was just the first week of March.
And the Housing Plan Implementation Committee has recommended that these go forward. And ultimately, of course, it's the ARB's decision to take all the information into consideration and then ask the good folks at town meeting to have their say on this. And there are some fairly specific requirements for an ADU in any unit. It could not be built after, or it could not be in a unit that exists after February 14th of this year, when the regulations were initially proposed. So someone couldn't come in and build a 700 square foot addition, 750 square foot addition on their home specifically for the purpose of becoming an ADU. The cost of that, by the way, would be incredibly prohibitive. It would all have to be done by special permit, meaning that the applicant would have to come before the ARB, show that they were in compliance with all the state sanitary codes and state building codes to make sure that they were in compliance with anything and a special permit would be issued. They would have to register and go through a legal process to affirm that what was in place was being used for its intended purpose as the applicant would have stated at the time the special permit was presumably issued. One of those requirements that any lease would have to be for at least a year. They would have to recertify that with the Department and Inspectional Services on a yearly basis. And if any condition were found to be lacking, even if simple as a failure to recertify, permit would be pulled and the unit would have to be taken away. Personally, I think it's better to have these units out in the open and to have to abide by a certain standard in the codes that are currently in place, and give inspectional services the tools to do the job that they're more than capable of doing.
Okay, again, we are really running out of time, so I would, though, ask you briefly to comment on, okay, project out, you tell me how long, to evaluate and assess whether these new regulations, or new, I should say, bylaws, are having the effects that you are hoping for or intending.
It is a never-ending process, James, and evaluation is not a benchmark after a year and then we stop. It's here's where we are after a year and whether things are working. If the bylaw needs to be tweaked at that point, that can be done. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years out. These are continually living, thriving documents. The beauty of the zoning bylaw is that it lives. It's there to be amended and to work as best, specifically for the town of Arlington and its residents, as it possibly can. And if certain affordability requirements aren't working, or if it turns out that more is needed, then that will become part of the analysis as the next town meeting cycle or two moves forward.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that basically the work of the ARB involves continually reevaluating everything from what you passed last year to what you did 3 or 4 years ago to I don't know how far back, to continually reassess how and tweak, as you say.
As I said earlier this evening, it is an ongoing process. It doesn't live in a vacuum where it's come up with an idea, present it to town meeting approves it, and we move on to the next idea. We are continually looking at ways to improve the town, to improve the housing stock, to improve the economic situation of the town, to keep our neighborhoods healthy, livable, walkable, desirable, keep the economy growing, keep it strong, and give residents the amenities in town that they want to see, not only in 2019 and where we live now, but for what our children might see, and so on and so forth.
I agree. You have both the burden and the benefit of a robust citizenry for making comments on things. There's also a parallel process that's a little bit more rough and informal. That's the sidewalk analysis, when someone is going by and looks up and says, how did this thing ever get built? And we hear that. We are hearing that today. Now, we can't accommodate everyone's sense of style and taste, but there are people who are already concerned about what they see in the built environment around them. And again, asking that gut level, street level question, how did this thing ever get built? And I think if we permit accessory dwelling units, we will hear from our residents in many corners of town the refrain that I thought I was living in a neighborhood of single-family homes and everyone around me is running a twofer.
I don't think we'll see that.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
I think both of you have made your very thoughtful analyses of that issue clear enough, and I would like to actually move on just to the last phase of tonight's conversation, and that is to invite you to speak for up to 2 minutes. You don't need to take the full 2 minutes, of course, but up to 2 minutes, a closing statement, and then we will say goodnight.
Yeah.
And we'll start with you.
All right. Thank you, James. Thank you, Michael, for participating this evening. When I go up and down Mass Ave and Summer Street, I see potential. I see the potential for growth. I see the potential for the addition of the kind of amenities that the people of Arlington have been asking for and aren't always able to get. I see the idea of a more vibrant, walkable, accessible downtown. I see Broadway Plaza and envision trees and additional outdoor seating and people walking and playing there on the weekends and shopping in stores up and down Mass Ave, patronizing restaurants in town, and walking again. And I make that point because we are a town. We are a town that is accessible, that is friendly, that is walkable, that just needs a little bit of a push in the right direction to be more than it currently is. And it is a wonderful place to live, and I wish more people could experience that. And I think the zoning bylaw amendments that we're proposing this year unlock that potential and can lead to the kind of vibrancy that we see in similar towns where people are out on weeknights and late at night on weekends taking advantage of everything the town has to offer. I think as we move forward through this phase and the next few years, from the recommendations in the master plan and the things that the people in town have been asking for, we can get there. It's not just a vision of 2019 or 2020, but 2030, 40, 50. It's a matter of being able to unlock that potential.
And there I have to cut you off.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Ruderman.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you to ACMi, and thank you, Andrew, also for making yourselves available for this discussion. It's a rare opportunity to sit down face-to-face, one-on-one, and talk about issues that come up in front of town meeting in this kind of detail, in this kind of depth of ideas, where ideas are exchanged and immediately considered and evaluated here one-to-one. I want to thank also you folks who have been following this at home. You have the opportunity to make your views heard on this. I'm sure many people still have questions. These amendments are data-driven and very dense. So please, call your town meeting members. Ask them what they think. You can look at the amendments, you can look at all the town meeting articles on the town clerk's webpage and the link to a town meeting there. Ask your town meeting members what they think. Tell them what you think. Please come out and vote for your town meeting representation on Saturday, April 6th. These are the folks who are going to join us in town hall over the course of so many nights and make decisions on these. You elect us to represent you. You elect us to be informed. You elect us to use our best judgment, and you elect us to explain to you what it is we feel that best judgment is. So please get in touch with your town meeting members. If you're not certain, again, town clerk's office can direct you to those that represent your precinct. Please vote on April 6th. Please stay involved in the process. Thank you so much for giving us a piece of your time and your attention tonight.
Well, I can't really say it any better than Michael just did, but we do appreciate your being here, and we certainly appreciate the two of you being here. It takes an awful lot of thought and perseverance and energy to delve into these issues to the degree that you both clearly have, and we appreciate the informed and elucidating conversation that we have heard as a result of that. I did want to mention just a couple of things to add to what Michael was saying, or to reiterate. Obviously, the election is coming up on April 6th, which will include your town meeting representation, or a portion thereof at least, and you should certainly, please do, as Michael was saying, participate in that. But also between now and town meeting itself, which starts on April 22nd, there will be precinct meetings for each of the precincts as we understand it, and you can find that information out as well, I believe, off of the town's website. And that is an opportunity for you to go and meet your town meeting members, existing ones, and new ones as well, I'm sure, and then to let them know at that point where you stand or how you feel about these things. So part of this conversation happening at this time is to help you to get a sense of and grasp of the issues, and then be able to still have time to go and make your voices heard before town meeting itself actually convenes. So without further ado, and with one last thanks to Michael Ruderman and to Andrew Bunnell for being here tonight, thank you as well. I'm James Milan. We'll see you next time.